Hello there and welcome to Sharing the Wisdom, brought to you by TCM Academy. My name is Kevin Durgin and I'm absolutely honoured to be part of shining a light on some of the wonderful work that is going on in and around the world of TCM. Today, we are going to meet Alaine Duncan, author of The Tao of Trauma, which is published by North Atlantic Books. And we're here today to talk about her work treating survivors of trauma and to hopefully give you some helpful tips to help you when you are working with your trauma patients in your clinic. Hello, Alaine.
Hello, Kevin. So nice to be with you.
Thank you so much. So Alaine, you are very well known in the world of trauma. You've got a trauma training course that you deliver for the TCM Academy. I would love to hear first of all about your journey into becoming a practitioner of Chinese medicine, and also how that journey has led you to focus on trauma.
Wow, great question. We could talk for a long time. In 1978, I was working as a kidney dialysis technician, and I stuck myself with a needle from a patient, and I contracted hepatitis C at a time when hepatitis C was not really very well known. They called it non-A, non-B hepatitis, and there was no way to diagnose or treat it by Western methods. So I was pretty debilitated, pretty ill over a period of actually 25 years before Western medicine advanced to a level where I could be treated with ribavirin and interferon to eliminate the virus. And thankfully, I was able to eliminate the virus. But I sought out acupuncture as a patient. So I started out at the other end of the needle and then was so moved that, I wanted to give away what I had gotten. I think as a little girl, I was torn between whether I wanted to be a doctor or I wanted to be a minister. And I realized when I got to acupuncture school that I could, in some ways, be both. So it felt like a greased chute for me to begin to study and practice. And I think the other thread that might be an important thread is that I was also in the era of the 70s, I was an activist. I was a community activist. I was very concerned about everything from apartheid in South Africa to liberation struggles in South America to anti-Klan work here in the United States, women's movement, women's health movement. So the work with trauma, when the work with trauma kind of emerged, it felt like an integration of my passion for healing, offering healing to individuals and also offering healing to communities and the impact of trauma on social dynamics and how to bring. I've done a lot of thinking in the last year. I'm based in the United States. I'm based in the traditional land of the Anacostan people near the banks of the Anacostia River outside Washington, D.C. And I've done a lot of thinking about our nation as a trauma survivor and how to use the neurophysiology of Western medicine along with Chinese medicine to explore the arousal, the sympathetic arousal we've seen in our country and how to restore regulation, how wonderful it is that that arousal has had some opportunities for expression and release in the last year, and what we can do with our now more expanded energy body as a nation.
Gosh.
And I think maybe as a world, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we certainly need a lot of healing.
We certainly need a lot of healing. Yeah.
So from a Western perspective, trauma is still not hugely understood.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a role that Chinese medicine has to play in resolving trauma. Um, could you talk to us a little bit about the role that Chinese medicine has to play in
Well,
trauma?
it's really rather fascinating to me. On the one hand, when I first started studying somatic experiencing, which is a model for trauma resolution that's rooted in Western neurophysiology, like day one of class, they said, well, the sympathetic nervous system is about arousal and the parasympathetic nervous system is about restoration of regulation and rest and digest. And I thought, well, that sounds an awful lot like yin and yang to me. I think I found my place. So that's one dynamic. And then there's this other very fascinating dynamic that Western neurophysiologists have studied the stress response, predator-prey relationships in the animal kingdom, and they defined 5 phases of the of the self-protective response. And do you know that those 5 phases exactly match the 5 elements?
Wow.
They would have to, right? They would have to. So I've kind of renamed them a little bit to kind of comply with 5 element theory, but the first one is awaken arousal. So that's the function of the PO, function of the animal soul to notice that there's something new in the environment. That then signals threat using the kidney adrenal system to recognize fear and the need to wake up and give power to a response. Then we come up to what I call mobilize a response, the function of the wood element to fight or flight. To the general of the armed forces is going to look for and find our strategy and mobilize the response. We come up to the fire element, and the task is to restore coherence. Like the fire gives the signal, the heart gives the signal of threat with a rapid heartbeat and commands the whole body to come into action, but it also has the job to return to a regular heartbeat and signal the body that it's over and we survived. And then we come around to the earth, I refer to as digest the gristle. So no matter how successfully we made it around all those steps, there's still going to be some gristle. There's still going to be some troubling memories that we need to digest so that we harvest lessons that are expanding rather than contracting, so that the lessons from these experiences we have make our life bigger instead of smaller. So, and then we come back around to the metal, and now we're prepared to meet a new challenge without being encumbered by an incomplete response in one of those steps. So the theory is that survivors will experience symptoms if they are incomplete in one of those steps. And this is where we are at such a enhanced benefit, because the symptoms that they experience will then somehow be related to the step that they missed. So we get to use all of the correspondences of the 5 element model. So we can notice, for example, that someone who was thwarted maybe in their mobilization response, that they may have trouble with their sinews and their tendons. There may be a way that their capacity to orient and see, like, can they see all the way over there, or do they only see over here? This is the function of the gallbladder and the liver to help us to orient and see. So we can then choose both touch approaches through touch and through needles that correspond to the step in the threat response that they missed or that was left incomplete, and where trauma gets stored in the tissues.
Yes.
Pretty cool, isn't it?
It is so cool. It is so cool. And I love the way in which it is focused on each of the elements and that cycle, and from our medicine, which is about, we need to leave one area before we're able to move on to the next element.
Right. That's right. And it also, it also makes approaches that are protocols or formulaic approaches. It makes it clear that they are not helpful. That because we might be in the same car accident, but because you have a certain constitution and I have a certain constitution, I'm going to come away from it differently than you are. So I can't just automatically treat heart 7 and think that we're all going to be, that it's going to serve us both in the same way.
Yes. So could you describe some of the underlying causes of trauma, and why some people do become traumatized, and it can affect long swathes of their life. And
That's
yet others are able to walk away from very traumatic events seemingly fine.
exactly. I really appreciate that question because trauma is definitely in the experience of the individual and not in the story of their experience. Because one person's story can be the same as, what we say, um, many diseases, one treatment, many diseases. We apply to the individual, not to the story. Um, some of the most interesting research to me is being done at the Centers for Disease Control here in the US. Um, they call it the Adverse Childhood Experiences Research. And what it was initially started at Kaiser Healthcare in California in an obesity clinic where they discovered that people would lose 50 and 100 pounds, 25 and 50 kilos, and then gain it back. And why? And the physicians that were running that clinic were good enough scientists that they started to inquire. They were puzzled enough, they were curious. And what they discovered was almost uniformly pre and perinatal trauma. And these were actually people who had good enough jobs that they had healthcare insurance. So they weren't just destitute, down and out, very very poor people. They were actually middle class people. Um, and the research became so complex and substantial that they transferred it over to CDC, where it's been carried on since. But what they've discovered is that people who have multiple experiences of trauma as infants or young children, things like maybe the cord around the neck or an early surgery, or maybe there was drug abuse in the home, or there was abuse in the home, or there was toxic fumes, or all the things that we experience. Maybe they grew up in a war zone. I mean, that wasn't in their study, but I think about it a lot. Intrusive sounds like explosions going off, things like that, or young infant. That if you have 4 or more of those kinds of experiences in infancy, you have much higher rates of autoimmune illness, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of osteoporosis, migraine headache patterns, obesity, drug addiction, suicidality. So it's not just this was the first research that said troubling childhood is not exclusively a mental health problem, that these traumatic experiences get hidden away in our tissues and affect our physiology. And when they occur before we've developed language, we can't use exclusively language-driven approaches to access them. We have to use body-centered approaches in order to access the dysregulation that's in our tissues. So I like to say that trauma is a vibrational illness, acupuncture is vibrational medicine. So we're actually perfect. We have the perfect
We
modality.
are.
We are just perfect. But the unfortunate thing is that very few acupuncture colleges provide training or education in how to recognize trauma and how to the different patient management strategies, the different ethical considerations, the different ways to approach this kind of patient that can yield some success. We are kind of famous actually for either over treating our patients, like too many needles in someone with a highly dysregulated system creates pain and more dysregulation, and they leave our practice. Or people have their history so tucked away, so hidden away that we don't even see it. We don't recognize it, and then of course we can't.
So, how are we as practitioners, how are we able to recognize the effects of trauma in our patients?
Well, I think the first way is to know that what I call the strange, rare, and peculiar symptoms that someone comes with, the things that are a little bit elusive, a little bit intangible, a little bit uh, challenging for Western medicine, like the things I mentioned, migraine headaches, autoimmune illness, things like that, that if someone comes with that, you can kind of bet my expression is dollars to donuts. I don't know how much that's an internationally known expression, but you can pretty much assume that there's some autonomic nervous system dysregulation underneath their symptoms that arose from some experience of trauma. And the other thing is that the people who experience this kind of dysregulation as in their infancy, they're left with less capacity, lowered resiliency to manage situational trauma or shock trauma as an adult. Like the more experience you have with trauma, it doesn't make you more resilient. It actually makes you less resilient unless you have some care. And then it can make you more resilient. So we not only get to help repair past wounds, we also get to enhance capacity to live a fuller life in the future. And we can reduce domestic violence, we can reduce community violence, we can enhance more, give less, the morbidity, change morbidity and mortality rates. We can affect public health. We can affect capacity for learning in the schools, certainly the criminal justice system, public health system. I mean, the world needs its healers. Let me just say that.
Yes. Now, you mentioned before about not filling patients full of needles, particularly when they're coming to you and they're in a already traumatized state. Where would you start the process of helping the patient to recover?
Yeah, I think my two key takeaways are safety and relationship. So if a patient needs to be put in charge of what feels good to them. So that might mean wanting to sit facing the door, or maybe it's sitting facing the window. It's going to vary. It may be letting them decide the distance you're sitting between each other. If I'm sitting too close, they might feel threatened. If I'm sitting too far away, they might feel abandoned. So what's the sweet spot? And have them tell you. I often ask a question like, when you feel the most like yourself, where are you and what are you doing? And if they tell me, well, at the beach, then I want to know, is it either floating in the water or watching the waves, or is it the sun shining on your back? Or is it the feel of the sand under your feet? So I can use a question like that to explore the 5 elements in this person. So I want to get, because these people, these survivors, will often have many, many symptoms, like every element, every official is affected when a big vibration goes through. But what I want to do is support core regulation. I don't want to get lost in 1,000 symptoms. I want to help support core regulation. And when I've done that, then the other symptoms fall away. So my main job is to sort out from a 5 element perspective, where are we sitting here? And then I don't always start with needles. Sometimes I'll start with touch, or I'll start with some body awareness exercises, or some things that help just begin to tilt the person, if they're in hyperarousal, more towards their zone of comfort. And if they're in collapse, more towards restore more tone in their system, so that when I place a needle, their internal vector of energy is moving towards regulation, and I'm stimulating regulation rather than stimulating dysregulation if I place a needle too soon.
Now, when you're talking with your trauma patients about what happened to them, how are you able to approach the subject of the trauma without carefully and without making them relive that trauma?
Really important question, Kevin. Really important question. Sometimes they won't know what trauma happened. If it happened as an infant, sometimes they don't know their birth story, or they don't know. So it almost doesn't matter. And if they do know, like it was a current car accident or a street mugging or something like that, my first question will be, when did you know it was over? There was a fellow, when I was at Walter Reed Army Medical Center doing a wellness clinic for the staff there many years ago. There was a soldier who was helping us unload some treatment tables to set up our clinic. And I think I said something like, welcome home, I'm glad you got home safe. And he started to tell me his story. He said, well, you know what, when I got injured, I couldn't speak. I lost my capacity to speak. And they airlifted me to Lansdal, to Germany. And I don't remember if I said, I asked him, when did you know it was over? So they airlifted me to Lansdal, and I started walking around the woods in Germany. And it took me back to my home in northern Wisconsin, which is a Midwestern state here in the US where there's a lot of woods. And he said, you know, I started talking to God, and then I knew I was going to be okay. And he had never really quite summed up in his eyes. He didn't really say this, but in his eyes, I could see he hadn't really anchored or claimed that it was over until that moment. And then he knew it was over. And he was just a little taller, a little more substantial, you know. And it was a wonderful moment. And it took, you know, it was like 5 minutes. So it doesn't have to be a long time, always.
I love that. How
Yeah.
did you know when it was over?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um, okay, final question.
Okay.
Uh, when we are entering, well, you just telling me that, you know, saying, asking that question about how you knew it was over, I found that very, very emotional, and that tugged at something within me.
Mhm.
When we're talking to patients about um, traumatic life events, it can, particularly if we're novice practitioners, it can come into us and it can affect us. I remember at the beginning of my practice, I would have sleepless nights sometimes because I wasn't able to hold the trauma in the treatment room. How can we protect ourselves
Yeah.
when working with somebody else's trauma?
Yeah. Well, I think one thing is that to know that we don't have to invite them into the story. That we are skilled in observing movements towards coherence and movements away from coherence as part of our training as acupuncturists. So that's the more important thing to observe than to dissect the story. So if we're not listening to the stories all day long, maybe it's not only less burdensome for our clients, they don't have to relive their experience, but it's also less of a burden on us. So I think that's one thing. Um, and I think the other thing, uh, the you know, our zone of resiliency is filled with this wave of the movement between yin and yang. And we can trust that even though there's a lot of dysregulation showing, we can stand in awareness that that regulated wave that moves the sun in the sky and the moon at night and the seasons and all the movements of nature, that that regulated wave is still in there and still available, so that we can hold some sense of possibility against our despair. um,
The hope.
the hope, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm with you. Sometimes it is just absolutely overwhelming, the what one human being can do to another. It's disheartening. Um, but focusing on capacity for resilience and recovery, that as much as we're hardwired to go into dysregulation, to have a big sympathetic rise when we need one, and to, you know, potentially a parasympathetic collapse when we need that, we're hardwired for that, but we're also hardwired to return to balance, to return to regulation. And just to know that the Tao is right there with us, and we can rest into our Taoist ancestors as well as our blood ancestors to carry and support us, um, and that we're doing incredibly noble and important work, just incredibly noble and important work for our world culture, as well as for the individuals that we treat.
Alaine Duncan, thank
Mhm.
you so much for joining us today.
It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Yeah, it's great. Love working with TCMA.